Hey everyone. So I want to take a little bit of time to go over the PowerPoint on Chapter 2, the writing process. So we have already looked at most of the writing process. We've looked at pre-writing strategies. We've looked at how to create introductions and thesis statements, how to focus on body paragraphs, how to do conclusions. But again, those were all lessons that really applied to writing in general. And here in Chapter 2, we're going to take everything that we learned about the writing process and learn how to adapt it to writing a literary essay in particular. Right? So we are going to talk briefly about the traditional parts of an essay. We are also going to spend a little bit of time talking about argument, the elements of a good argument. We're going to take a look at sort of like the typical plan for presenting an argument, the organization. We're going to take a look at the process of using details from a story to develop our claims and our ideas, how to differentiate between critical comments and just mere plot details. And then we will talk a little bit more about successful intros and conclusions. Okay. So we already know that a traditional essay has three main parts. The beginning, which is the introductory paragraph, the middle, which are the body paragraphs, and the end, which is the concluding paragraph. So we want to look at how each part of an essay, how it works, how it should be developed when we're writing a literary essay. We're going to come back and talk about introductions and conclusions towards the end of the PowerPoint, but we want to focus first on the biggest part of the essay, which are the body paragraphs. This is where your argument is, right? So we have to think about how you're going to argue your interpretation of a story or of a poem. If you want your readers to accept your interpretation of the story, you have to convince them that your point of view is valid, that it's correct, that it's worth agreeing with. So your interpretation is an argument. And that's why we're looking here at how to argue your interpretation and what the elements of a good argument are. And those elements are claims, evidence, reasoning, and refutation. Right? So the claim is the engine that propels any argument. It's also called a proposition or a premise, a hypothesis. In literary criticism, it's your thesis statement. That's your claim. So a sample claim for our story Eveline would be, Eveline lacks courage to flee from her domineering father and to seek her own happiness. She lacks courage. This is a statement that others could disagree with. Not everyone would read the story and think that the primary reason that she stays is because she lacks courage. They might have a different interpretation. So you have to argue that your interpretation is correct. This is your claim, your thesis statement. Not only does it present your point of view, your stance on the argument, but it also tells the reader what direction the essay will take. So it covers everything that a thesis is supposed to do. It's usually then broken down into secondary claims, or what will be like your main points in the body of the essay. Those main points should be captured in your topic sentences of your body paragraphs. So, for instance, this is not a literary example, just a very easy example. If I were writing an essay about how great um, the restaurant Chick-fil-A is. My thesis statement in my introductory paragraph, my claim would be that Chick-fil-A is a fantastic place to eat because of their cleanliness, their service, and their food. Okay? Then I think to myself, okay, what are my main points? Okay, first thing that makes Chick-fil-A so great is they're always clean. Another thing that makes Chick-fil-A so great is their customer service. So in addition to their cleanliness and customer service, Chick-fil-A also has delicious food. Those are my three main points that I'm going to discuss in the body of my essay, but they are also my topic sentences for those sections. Now, perhaps my first main point is a really big one, or my last main point is a really big one, and that topic sentence I cannot develop it in just one paragraph. Maybe it will take 2 or 3. So that secondary claim will only show up in the first paragraph where I start talking about that idea. But I will still have topic sentences for the additional paragraphs that add on to it. But initially, to start off with, you should think of your main points as your secondary claims, which will be your topic sentences for your body paragraphs. Right? And those are the ones that are going to help prove your thesis. How do you prove your thesis? This is where evidence comes in. Any argument requires evidence, right? It requires convincing. You have to convince the readers. In this case, you have to convince them that, you have to show them how you arrived at your interpretation. You have to show the reader what the claim is based on. This is mostly going to come from the story itself. You're going to look at the details and examples from the story itself, picking out words, phrases, dialogue from the story. It can also come from your own experiences and observations to a certain extent. We can say things like, anyone who has been physically abused would often have this type of reaction. We can say things like that. Things that would be common knowledge, common experiences. We can use those to help bolster our interpretation. You can also use evidence that comes from outside of the text in things like pop culture, history, or literary criticism, which is where you're looking at an article from a journal and someone else has written about Evelyn, and you're going to use part of their argument to help bolster your own, or you're going to refute it. You're going to say they were wrong. So you can also use other critical interpretations and literary criticism in your essay as well. Right? But the majority of what you're going to have as evidence is going to come from the story itself. Okay? But simply saying, here's what I think, and here's the evidence for it, you have to have the next element of good argument, which is reasoning. Reasoning is the thinking process that you used to connect the evidence to your claim. Sometimes the connection is pretty clear and obvious, but most of the time, you're going to be expected to explain how you arrived at your interpretation. So for example, you can identify all different kinds of words and phrases from the story that indicate that Evelyn is afraid of her father. But you can't just list them or say, here's some words and phrases that are used. You then have to explain how they show us that Evelyn is afraid of her father, and how we can then assume that she might also be afraid of all other men, including Frank, right? This way your reader understands your line of thinking. For example, if we're talking about the story of an hour, Um, we can't just say the open window is an important element of the setting, or we can't just say that the open window and the scene outside of the window is uh, a symbol of hope and new life. You can't just leave it at that. You have to explain your reasoning. You have to explain what signs of spring are out there and what those signs of spring indicate, and then how that lets us know that what she sees outside the window is important. Connect it to your claim. So the reasoning is super important. The reasoning is how you show your reader the connection between your claim and your evidence. It shows your reader why your evidence proves your claim, right? You have to go through the reasoning. And then the fourth element of good argument is refutation. You know, we've already learned that if you are arguing for a certain interpretation, you are arguing. Any argument automatically implies that there are other points of view possible. In any good argument, you want to address those opposing points of view. You don't want to pretend like they don't exist. You don't want to, try to hide them off in the corner so your reader doesn't know about them. Bring them right out in the forefront. Address them and deal with them head on. So, you want to acknowledge and respond to those other points of views. That's called refutation. And there's no one way to incorporate that into a literary essay. Sometimes an author will do it right up front. They'll have their introductory paragraph where they tell us their claim, and then in the very next paragraph, maybe a couple paragraphs, they will immediately tackle the opposing points of view, and then spend the rest of the essay showing why their own point of view is more correct than these initial ones that she discussed. You could also do it at the very end. Go through your own argument first, and then have a section afterwards where they address some of the opposing points of view and why those aren't as valid as the authors. Sometimes you can do it point by point. So every little subclaim, every secondary claim that you make, you also, not only do you make that claim and support your own interpretation, but at the same time you also incorporate what other people might think and show how they're wrong and you're right for every element that you're looking at. But the goal is to show why the other interpretations are faulty or inaccurate or limited. And it might not just be saying you're dead wrong. It might just be like, you're only this interpretation only looks at part of the story. It's not looking at the whole thing, or it's not taking this into consideration. So it just might be that it's a limited interpretation, whereas yours is more inclusive and more comprehensive, right? So you're basically saying, here's another valid interpretation of the story, but if you look closer at my interpretation, you'll see it's still more stronger and more accurate. So you want to include the opposing points of view. Don't ignore them, right? So building and presenting that argument usually involves 5 tasks. So you're going to introduce your subject that you're going to write about. For example, Evelyn's decision not to go with Frank. And you're going to supply some context for your approach. Then you're going to state your main point or your thesis. This is your claim. That's all happening in the introductory paragraph. Then you're going to provide evidence and reasoning to support your claims. This will be the longest part of your argument. This is going to be the body of your essay. Each secondary claim will take a paragraph or more to develop. And remember, this is where you're pulling in the specific details from the story and also explaining to your reader how those details prove your interpretation or your claim. At some point along the way, you're going to respond to opposing viewpoints. You're going to have some refutation in there, so that's the 4th thing. And then the last step is summing up the argument, reminding your readers of what your thesis was and the strength of your evidence. Right? So those 5 tasks are what make up a literary essay. Like again, steps 1 and 2 typically happen in the first paragraph. Step 3 is the whole body of the essay. Step 4 is the one where you can kind of play with it a little bit. It might actually come before step 3. It might coincide with step 3. So here on slide 11, we've got 2 possible ways of building our argument. So our beginning claim, our main claim in the introduction. Eveline lacked courage to flee from her domineering father and to seek her own happiness. So in the middle of the essay, we're going to provide evidence of her lack of courage, and it can be seen in the following. Her passivity as a female who lacks resources and imagination to challenge her traditional role. We're going to pull in examples from the story to prove that. Her physical fear of her father, which is perhaps generalized to all men. Again, pull in details from the story to help prove that. And then her reverence for her mother's memory and the promise she made to keep the family together. Pull in specific evidence from that to show how it proves she lacks courage. And then at the end, Eveline exemplifies how a woman may be trapped by passivity, fear, and obligations. Right? So that's one way of doing it. You can also use your topic sentences as to act as the secondary claims, like I mentioned before. So, Eveline lacks courage to flee from her domineering father and to seek her own happiness. Eveline's lack of courage is illustrated in these ways, and here's your topic sentences. She is afraid to go against her religious beliefs. That would be our first main point, our first secondary claim. Pull in evidence to support it. She's afraid something will happen to her father if she leaves him. This is another thing she fears. Pull in evidence. She is afraid her mother's memory will continue to haunt her. Pull in evidence. She is afraid Frank will treat her as her father treated her mother. Pull in evidence. So instead of the first example of how to organize it dealt with the concepts as a way of organizing the body. This second option comes up with direct topic sentences that each embody a different fear that Eveline has. And that's how they organized it. Either way would work fine, but you can just see that there is a definite rhyme or reason to how the body of the essay is laid out. Okay. As you write that middle section, the body of the essay, you have to decide which points you're going to take up first and which ones you're going to use later, right? How do you organize the ideas? How do you arrange them? Well, one way is chronological order. You can do it based on time. You can, talk about the story in the order that it happens. This works particularly well with poetry, especially when it's shorter poetry. You can literally discuss the poem from start to finish. You can do it with short stories as well, but you just have to make sure that there's a critical thinking process along the way and that it's not just plot summary. Because if you're going through the story from start to finish, you run a big risk of simply retelling us what's happening in each section, and then the essay becomes more of a summary than any kind of critical analysis. The way that most literary essays are organized, especially if we're dealing with short stories or novels or plays, would be logical order. So you're going to arrange your main ideas in an order that appeals to the reader's sense of logic, their intelligence. Typically, we start with the main point that is kind of the least important or the least impressive, and we work our way up towards the most important main idea, the one that packs the biggest punch, that has the most impact. And the reason we do that is because readers are more likely, it's just human nature, psychology has proven it, humans are more likely to remember what they read last. So you want to save your biggest and best points for last. In the previous slide where we looked at the 2 plans of development, the longer one on the right-hand side where they looked at the topic sentences to organize it, that was an example of arranging the ideas in a logical order. Um, this author felt that Evelyn going against her religious beliefs, that fear, was not as big or not as important or impressive as the other fears. And they felt like the biggest reason why she lacks courage to flee from her father and find her own happiness, the biggest and most important reason, is because she's afraid Frank will treat her the same way her father treated her mother. So that's why this author saved that point for last. So they went from maybe the, either the least impressive or maybe the most obvious. Maybe the most obvious reason is the religious beliefs. So they worked their way from most obvious to most surprising or most revealing. So you have to think about the most logical way, the best way to arrange your ideas and organize the body of the essay, keeping your reader in mind and keeping what your purpose is in mind, right? And you want to make sure that you're using those details to help develop your claims and your secondary claims, your main points. You want the balance between your interpretive points and the details that you use. You want the balance to be good. It's very important. Because if your argument goes too far into the interpretive direction, it will sound very abstract, very personal. But if it goes too far in just talking about details from the story, it's going to seem more like summary rather than analysis. So within the argument, you're going to make several critical generalizations relating to your main claim, and those are your topic sentences, right? Remember that you want to state each topic sentence very clearly, and you want to support each one with enough references to the story to be convincing. Use your pre-writing activities you did in the beginning to figure out and help you choose the details that you're going to include. And then I have an example on slide 14 of how you can do that, how you mix your subclaim, your topic sentence, with your interpretation and the details from the story to support it. So the example says, Evelyn lacks courage to seek a life of her own because she fears that her father will not be able to cope if she leaves him. That's the main idea of this paragraph, what we're trying to prove in this paragraph. Her anxiety is heightened as she recalls that she and her brothers and sisters are grown up and that her mother is dead. That's a little bit of summary. If she leaves, her father will be all alone. She realizes that he is, quote, usually fairly bad on a Saturday night, end quote, and recognizes that his drinking problem will not get any better after she leaves. Also, she has noticed that, again, quote, her father was becoming old lately, and she assumes that he would miss her. As a dutiful daughter, Evelyn seems to feel that going away with Frank means abandoning her aging father, and that may be why she has written a letter to him, to ease the blow of her departure and to soothe her own conscience. So we had this idea in the beginning, the topic sentence. Notice how this author used very specific details and brief quotations from the story to develop that idea that's stated in the topic sentence, and then ends with that interpretation and reasoning to show us why that evidence helped prove the topic sentence. You want that balance, right? Where you place your analytical content, your reasoning, and your interpretation is going to affect how your argument is perceived. Even if you have a solid interpretation, if your critical insights are in the middle of your paragraphs and you're starting and ending with summary or details from the story, it's going to sound like all summary. You want a very critical focus. You want it to be sharp. The topic sentences of your body paragraphs should be the critical observations that you're using to support your thesis in the beginning. The middle of the paragraph is where you bring in the details from the story and provide your reasoning, and then the paragraph should end with more of your interpretation and how the evidence proves the topic sentence. that's very critical. I always call it the sandwich method. Start with your own claim, your own idea in the topic sentence. Then refer to elements from the story and show us your line of reasoning. And then at the end, give us the full impact of your reasoning and your interpretation. So you start and end with your own ideas. The middle of the paragraph should be limited to very brief mentions of the story. Only what you absolutely need to prove your point, right? I also want to talk about distinguishing critical comments from plot details. Because in the middle of your body paragraphs, you are pulling out examples, you're pulling out details from the story to help prove your point. But you want to make sure that you are not just giving us the detail from the story, but that you are also making a critical comment on it. So, for instance, a plot detail from, it's a short story called The Lottery. A plot detail would be Jackson's story opens on a balmy summer day. Now, there might be a reason why you're pointing that out, but right now that's just a plot detail. You need to make a critical comment about that plot detail. If there's a reason that you're mentioning it, you need to make it clear why. So the critical comment would be, by setting her story on a balmy summer day, Jackson creates a false sense of well-being. Now we're actually saying something about that plot detail. Now it's a critical comment. Or, the other example here, 17 syllables begins with a communication problem between the teenager Rose and her mother. That's not telling us anything we don't already know. That's not making any kind of point or comment. That is just a plot detail. Why is it important? Why did you mention it to us? Well, okay, the first scene, a communication breakdown between the teenager Rosie and her mother, introduces the conflict between first and second generation immigrants to the United States. That's why it's important that there's a communication problem in the beginning. So be mindful that simply pointing out something from the story isn't enough. And if you do that too often, it will simply sound like a summary. You have to make sure that your plot details, that your story elements that you're talking about, that you connect them and make critical points about them. That is how you convince us. Another poetry detail. We're talking about a poem here. So another basic detail. Blanco's poem America contains a number of Spanish words and phrases mixed in with the English. That's not telling us anything we don't already know. Got to make a critical comment about it. Blanco sprinkles Spanish words and phrases throughout America to underscore the clash of cultures that he is describing in this poem. That's a critical comment. That's taking it a step further. Here is what is in the story, here is what is in the poem, and here's why that's important. So explain with critical comments, not just plot details. Okay? Now, that is a very brief rundown of how to tackle the middle of the essay. We are going to talk more in depth about creating that argument in Chapter 3. But that is an overview of what argument is and how it applies to a literary essay, and how you should think about organizing your ideas and how to use the evidence to help support your claims. I said earlier that we would come back and talk about the introduction and the conclusion. So where should you begin with a literary essay? First things first, postpone if nothing is coming to you. You do not have to write the introduction first just because it appears first in the essay. You can come back to it. You do need a thesis statement or a working thesis statement in mind when you begin, but you can always come back and write the introduction later. Once you're ready, you want to write an appealing opening, right? We've already learned about introductions. You want to grab the reader's attention, and you want to, slowly introduce your topic and take us towards that thesis statement, but you don't want to make bland statements, okay? You want to use something specific to start off with. You want to state your thesis. That's also very important. Do not announce your thesis. Do not say, I am going to show that the theme of the story of an hour is blah, blah, blah. Or in this essay, I'm going to discuss how setting and atmosphere work in Hills Like White Elephants. No, no, no. Do not announce the thesis. Just say, a close look at the setting in Hills Like White Elephants reveals exactly what the story is about. Okay? You want to be direct and to the point. You want to use vivid language. You don't want to announce it. You don't want to be apologetic. Do not draw attention to the fact that it's just your opinion. You want to be confident and cocky. And you want to state it like it's a fact, even if you are shaking in your boots, totally unsure of yourself. Be confident, right? So postpone if nothing comes, but you do need to eventually craft that introduction. And just remember what an introduction is supposed to do. Grab your reader's attention, introduce your topic, provide context or background information if necessary, and make sure that your claim is stated, that your thesis is stated, typically at the end of the introductory paragraph. Don't announce your thesis, don't be apologetic, and don't draw attention to your opinion. Be confident and say it like it's fact. Right? Conclusion. I've already learned about conclusions too. Remember, you want to reinforce how your analysis illuminates the theme. You want to remind us what a smarty pants you are, basically. You want to go back to your introduction, take a look at how you grabbed our attention, take a look at your thesis statement, and use that to your advantage to help craft a conclusion. And you want to make sure, again, that you are making it clear how your overall discussion of the story relates to the theme. The conclusion comes last in the essay. It is oftentimes the last thing that gets written, but it doesn't have to be. You can actually write ahead. You can write the conclusion first or midway through if something strikes you and you're like, oh, this would be a great way to end this essay. Now, come back to it and make sure that it still fits after you have finished the rest of the essay. But it's nice to have something to work with. You want an emphatic final sentence at the end of your conclusion, but you want to avoid things like, all in all, I think Eveline was a great story, and I think anyone would enjoy reading it and maybe even learn something from it. Be more specific, all right? Refer more to your claim, your argument. So, afraid of failing on her own, Eveline retreats into the familiar, telling herself that life with father cannot be as frightening as a risky, unknown life with Frank. So strong is her fear of failure that it overrides her fear of her father. She seems to decide that a predictable, if dreary and abused, life is better than a life without security or pattern. That reinforces the claim that we started with in the beginning. So, we're going to, again, like I said, talk a little bit more about how to really dig into the argument part, how to really work with your claim and your evidence and your reasoning. But at this point, we have kind of covered how to draft a literary essay, right? You're using your pre-writing activities, you're devising a working thesis statement, you've thought about how to arrange your main supporting points, you've looked at the details that you want to use to develop your argument, the details from your story. You've thought about your introduction, if not written it already, and you've thought about your conclusion, if not written it already. So we're going to look again more at building up that argument with your evidence and your reasoning. And then in a couple weeks, we're also going to take a look at APA format and how to use secondary sources in your essay. But right now, we've kind of reached the point where we're starting to get a little more comfortable thinking about how to develop an essay from start to finish, taking what we've learned about our two short stories, The Story of an Hour and Hills Like White Elephants, how to take all of that information we've learned and discussed and think about what we want to use to develop our interpretation and how to present that to the reader and convince them that we are correct. So we still have a little more ways to go, but we are getting closer and closer to being ready to write a literary essay. So if you have any questions about anything in this video or in this PowerPoint, let me know. Otherwise, watch the next one on Chapter 3 and learn a little bit more about the argument.